you very much for coming back. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Right. Here we have South Africa's current account deficit, narrowing to its smallest since 2012. And we've also had the news that Stats SA says that we accelerated in the consumer price index to 6.6%. What do you make of that?
Well, clearly it is quite encouraging that the current account has narrowed, but unfortunately it's also important to note that it's still particularly wide. It's still one of the widest amongst the G20, I think the second widest amongst the G20, and the fourth widest amongst the Fragile Five, which we often get compared to. So while this slowing growth is having an effect on retrenching imports relative to exports, which is encouraging. We've seen a positive impact on the rand today. The long-term trend is still negative, and we're still, unfortunately, not creating the right kind of policy to really see a sustained change in the current account going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, the problem here is that many people are saying that there's nothing new that came out of the State of the Nation address in addressing the current inflationary pressures that we have, the imminent oil price increases internationally, and of course the contractions that we've been having, for example, in the current account deficit, producer price inflation, and all that. This actually bringing some fear of the country slipping into recession, even though the Reserve Bank said, no, it won't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's quite frankly, it's really disappointing, the State of the Nation last night. President Zuma has the platform to talk about the economy and tell people what's going on, and quite frankly, it was a poor representation of what's going on in the economy. By all accounts, we've got an economic crisis in South Africa. We're slipping into recession, as you said. We've got strikes. We've got high inflation. We've got economic imbalances, and yet the president can't even admit that they exist. So clearly there needs to be a policy change in South Africa, and it's disappointing that we're not seeing that. And we're seeing that the result on the rand and interest rates, particularly if you compare South African markets relative to emerging market peers, a lot of them are making steps in the right direction. You can point towards India, for example. And we're not seeing that in South Africa, and it hopefully places the pressure on the Reserve Bank and the Treasury to make changes going forward. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that just yet.
Surely we cannot ignore the current release of Fitch and Standard & Poor's rating of South Africa. I mean, being at BBB, for us being the second most powerful economy in Africa after Nigeria, of course, we had the number one position and now number two. So what do you make out of this in terms of the monetary policy of the Reserve Bank being in tenterhooks to either leave interest rates unchanged or perhaps increased by 0.25%?
Well, it does clearly put pressure on both the Reserve Bank and the Treasury. The Reserve Bank, through the weaker rand and higher inflation, to, as you said, consider hiking interest rates. But also on the Treasury perspective, with higher interest rates, it's more costly to borrow, more costly for them to refinance and roll over debt. So at the margin, it should have an impact on policy. But unfortunately, as we saw from President Zuma last night, there's very little appreciation of the broader context that South Africa is in, which is very disappointing. So any structural change to policy just doesn't seem forthcoming. So
the emphasis on the issue of jobs
Mm-hmm.
is more on internships. Do you think that is a true reflection of the employment stats? Because actually unemployment is actually consistent in as far as people having stable jobs, permanent jobs, where they have benefits and a secured future.
Well, I mean, I would agree with you that just having internships is not good enough. I mean, once again, it comes back to my previous point. We need structural change in the economy rather than just changes at the margin. I mean, the whole idea of this youth wage subsidy is encouraging to some people, but once again, I think it misses the real point of the problem in the jobs market, which is far more structural. It's related to unions. It's related to the inability of workers and employers to be able to actually negotiate over what prices they want to find a market price at wages.
Mm-hmm. Given the demands of workers nowadays, which of course the percentage increase of the salary is way above the inflation rate, do you think that inflation is going to shoot up on the upside?
No, we don't think inflation is going to shoot up on the upside. The current inflation environment is actually quite benign due to things like weak credit growth. So there is a lot of inflationary pressure, but the domestic environment is not one where we would see a sudden rise in inflation. If credit growth was stronger, if economic growth was stronger, we might see inflation really accelerate.
Just
from
very
here.
briefly now on the issue of credit extension and consumer expenditure, or rather household expenditure. Do you think that there is going to be an increase in that, because people right now don't have money to spend? Disposable income has shrunk.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're in a very tight credit environment, tight consumer environment. We're seeing that in the retail sales numbers. Yes, they ticked up today, but they're still at particularly soft levels. As you said, credit growth is weak, and data that we're looking at shows that there's a fair amount of defaults. There's a lot of distressed borrowing going on in the economy. So none of those really point towards an uptick in consumer spending going forward.
All right. Thank you very much for your analytical perspective.
Pleasure.
Right. Robert Price is an economist at ETM Analystics right here on PM News.